The dining room at Auberge d'Orval smelled the way old money always does. Cedar and candle wax and something floral that costs more per bottle than most people earn in a week. Fiona Beaulieu had worked there for 11 months, and she still hadn't gotten used to it. Not the smell, not the silence, not the way the guests looked through her like she was made of glass. She'd learned to move quietly between tables, to anticipate without being asked, to smile at the right angle. Warm enough to be pleasant, distant enough to be invisible. That was the job. That was what they paid her for. She hadn't always been a waitress. 3 years ago, she'd been 18 months away from finishing her nursing degree at the University of Ottawa on the Dean's list, with a placement at the Civic already secured. Then her father's diagnosis came: early-onset Parkinson's, aggressive, requiring full-time care within the year, and the math became very simple, very quickly. Someone had to stay. Someone had to earn. Her older brother was in Vancouver with 2 kids, and a mortgage he was already drowning in. Her younger sister was 16, so Fiona stayed. She didn't think of it as sacrifice. She thought of it as arithmetic. Auberge d'Orval was the best-paying front-of-house job she could get without a hospitality degree, and she was good at it in the way people are good at things they are slightly too intelligent for. She memorized the menu, the wine list, the allergies, the preferred tables of the regulars. She never forgot a face. She never forgot what someone had ordered the last time they sat in her section. It was a Tuesday in late November when she first noticed the woman at table 9. The reservation was under the name Whitfield. Conrad Whitfield, which meant nothing to Fiona until her manager, a brittle man named Sébastien, appeared at her elbow before the party arrived and told her in a low voice that Mr. Whitfield was the founder of Whitfield Infrastructure Group, and that the table was to receive the highest possible level of attention and absolutely no improvisation. He said that last part, looking directly at her. She said, "Of course," and meant it. The party arrived at 7:15. Conrad Whitfield was in his early 60s, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, the kind of man who filled a room without trying. Beside him was a younger woman, mid-30s, sharp cheekbones, a dress that probably cost what Fiona made in a month, who placed her hand on his arm the moment they walked in, a gesture that managed to be both affectionate and proprietary. That was Celeste Duval, as Fiona would later learn, his fiancée, and behind them, walking slightly apart, was an older woman. She was perhaps 70, elegantly dressed in charcoal grey, with white hair pinned back at the nape of her neck. She moved carefully, with the measured attention of someone navigating a space they don't quite trust. She took her seat at the table and folded her hands in her lap and looked at nothing in particular. The way people do when they have learned to make themselves small. Fiona brought water. She set the glasses with the usual precision and was about to recite the evening specials when she noticed something. The older woman's eyes weren't vacant. They were tracking. Her gaze moved from the mouth of the sommelier to the mouth of Celeste, to the mouth of Conrad, following the conversation she could not hear. The slight tilt of her head, the way her fingers rested on the tablecloth, not fidgeting, but present, attentive. The small, barely perceptible movement of her lips as she silently read along with whatever Conrad was saying to Celeste about the wine. Fiona had done a clinical rotation in her second year of nursing school at a facility specializing in auditory and neurological rehabilitation. She had spent 6 weeks learning to communicate with patients who had lost their hearing, and another 3 volunteering with a community ASL group in Vanier, because she'd found she was good at it and because it gave her something that felt, at the time, like a future. She recognized what she was looking at. The older woman was deaf. Fiona glanced at Conrad. He was laughing at something Celeste had said, leaning back in his chair with the comfort of a man who had never once in his life felt out of place at a table like this one. He hadn't looked at the older woman since they sat down. Celeste had not looked at her once. Fiona set the water pitcher on the service station, took a quiet breath, and walked back to table 9. She crouched slightly beside the older woman, not in a way that would draw attention, just low enough to be in her line of sight, and she signed, carefully, "Hello, my name is Fiona. I'm your server tonight. Can I bring you something warm to drink before the meal?" The woman went very still. Then her eyes filled, not with tears, or not quite, but with something Fiona recognized as the specific shock of being seen. She pressed her fingers briefly to her lips, and then signed back, her hands moving with the fluency of someone who had been doing this for decades. "You know sign language?" "A little," Fiona signed, which was modest. "Enough. Are you warm enough?" "The room can get cold near the window." The woman's name, she signed, was Marguerite. Marguerite Whitfield, Conrad's mother. She had lost her hearing 4 years ago, following a neurological event, a severe blood pressure crisis that had damaged the auditory nerve. She had been learning ASL, she signed, but it was slow. She was 72, and her hands did not always do what she asked of them. Conrad did not know sign language. He had meant to learn. He was very busy. She signed that last part with an expression that was not quite resignation, and not quite grief, but something that lived between the two. Fiona straightened. She brought Marguerite a pot of chamomile tea without being asked, and when she returned to take the table's order, she signed the specials to Marguerite while speaking them aloud for Conrad and Celeste, moving her hands low and quiet, nothing theatrical about it. Conrad blinked. He watched her hands for a moment, then looked at his mother. Marguerite was smiling. It was the first time she had smiled since they walked in. Something moved across Conrad's face that Fiona could not fully name, something between recognition and guilt, which was perhaps the same thing. Celeste, who had been in the middle of asking about the duck confit, went quiet. The meal proceeded. Fiona checked on Marguerite between courses, keeping the exchanges brief and warm. She learned that Marguerite had grown up in Trois-Rivières, that she had 3 grandchildren she rarely saw, that she had once been an excellent pianist and still played occasionally, with the treble turned to maximum on the keyboard so she could feel the vibration through her hands. "It's not the same," she signed, "but it's something." "It's something," Fiona agreed. At one point while Fiona was at the service station, she became aware that Celeste had said something to Conrad in a low voice. She couldn't hear it, but she watched Celeste glance toward her with the particular expression of someone cataloguing a problem, and she felt the small, familiar warning signal that had kept her employed long enough to recognize what came next. She was right. Sebastian appeared at her elbow at 8:45, when the table was on dessert, and told her that Miss Duval had requested she be moved to a different section for the remainder of the evening, as her presence was causing a disruption. He said it quietly, and with the expression of a man who found the conversation distasteful but not particularly difficult. Fiona said, "Of course," and meant something else entirely. She was reassigned to the far end of the room, a section with 2 tables, both occupied by couples who needed nothing. She spent the next 40 minutes moving back and forth with studied efficiency and watching table 9 from the corner of her eye. Marguerite did not look toward her for several minutes, and then she did. Her face had gone careful again, the smile replaced by the contained expression she'd worn when she walked in. She held Fiona's gaze for a moment, then looked down at her plate. When the Whitfield party left, Celeste walked ahead without looking back. Conrad held the door and then followed. Marguerite was last, and as she passed the service station, she paused. She looked at Fiona. She signed very quickly. "Thank you." "You gave me an evening." Fiona signed back, "You gave me one too." She didn't tell anyone what had happened. There was no one to tell, really. Her father was asleep by the time she got home, and her sister had her earphones in, and the cat had no opinions on the matter. She made tea and sat at the kitchen table, and thought about the look on Marguerite's face when Fiona's hands had moved, and she let herself feel it for a few minutes before she put it away. 2 weeks later, the reservation came through again. Whitfield, Table 9, 8 o'clock. Fiona was not assigned to Section 3. She was assigned to the back bar, which had never happened before, and which Sebastian explained with a brevity that told her everything. Special request from the client. She understood. She said nothing. She worked the back bar efficiently and tried not to feel the particular flatness of someone who has been useful, and then put somewhere they cannot be useful anymore. What she did not know, could not have known, was that across the room, Marguerite Whitfield was sitting at Table 9 with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes moving from mouth to mouth, reading a conversation she was only partially following in a restaurant where the one person who had spoken to her in her own language had been removed from the room at her son's fiancé's request. What Fiona also did not know was that Marguerite had spent the 2 weeks between visits in a state of quiet agitation that her son had mistaken for fatigue, and that she had written 3 letters on paper in her careful cursive, the way she had always communicated when ASL wasn't possible, asking Conrad if the server from the last visit would be at Auberge d'Orval again. Conrad had not read the letters. They were on his desk, under a briefing document for a highway expansion project in northern Ontario. His assistant sorted his mail. The letters had been opened, noted as personal correspondence, and placed in the personal correspondence pile, which Conrad reviewed on Sundays when he had time, which he had not had. This was not deliberate neglect, it was the ordinary kind. The 3rd visit was a Saturday in December. Fiona was scheduled for Section 3, which she noticed with something she was careful not to let herself call hope. She arrived an hour early, as she always did, set her section with the precision that had become second nature, and was in the middle of polishing stemware when Sebastian told her there had been a change. She was being moved to Section 1, the front room, which was technically an upgrade in positioning, but was also, she knew, 40 feet from Table 9. She moved to Section 1. She watched, from 40 feet away, as the Whitfield party arrived. Conrad, Celeste, Marguerite. Marguerite sat, as she always did, slightly apart, with the attentiveness of someone who had learned to gather information from posture and expression, and the angle of a wine glass rather than from words. Fiona watched Celeste lean toward Conrad and gesture subtly toward the room, a small, proprietary sweep of the hand that Conrad nodded at without looking up from the menu. Fiona watched Marguerite watch them, and then Marguerite looked up and across the room and directly at Fiona. Fiona lifted her hand very slightly and signed, "Hello." Marguerite's face changed. She signed back a single word, "Still here, still here." Fiona confirmed. Celeste noticed. She didn't turn around. She was too composed for that, but her posture changed, the way a current changes direction underwater. She set her menu down. She said something to Conrad. Conrad looked up. Fiona was already moving to a different table, her notepad out, professional and uninvolved. But she had felt it, the shift. Something had begun to turn, and she didn't know yet which way it was going. She found out 2 days later. Sebastian called her into his office, which smelled of stale coffee and expense reports, and told her that Auberge d'Orval valued its relationship with the Whitfield Group enormously, and that the Whitfield Group had expressed concern that certain interactions between front-of-house staff and members of the Whitfield family were creating an uncomfortable dynamic, and that while her service record was excellent, the management felt it would be best for everyone if she concluded her employment at the end of the month. He could not look at her directly while he said it. She asked if she had done anything wrong. He said no. She asked if her performance had been substandard in any measurable way. He said it had not. She asked who had made the complaint. He looked at the expense reports. She understood. She left his office and went back to her section, and finished her shift with the same precision she always brought to it, because she had bills to pay and a father whose medication cost $400 a month, and because she was not going to give Sébastien or Celeste Duval or anyone the satisfaction of watching her fall apart in a restaurant that smelled like cedar and candle wax. She cried on the drive home, briefly, at a red light on the Champlain Bridge, and then she pulled it together because the light changed. What Fiona didn't know about Marguerite Whitfield would have surprised her. Marguerite had not lived 72 years by being easy to manage. She had raised a son largely on her own after her husband died young, had run a textile business in Trois-Rivières until she sold it at 65, had navigated a world that did not accommodate her deafness with anything resembling grace, and had built an accommodation for herself anyway, piece by piece, letter by letter. She was not the woman her son's fiancé took her for. Celeste had made the error, common among people who are accustomed to having things done on their behalf, of confusing quietness with passivity. Marguerite was quiet. She was also paying attention to everything. She had noticed, for instance, that Celeste had a habit of steering Conrad away from conversations with her own children from his first marriage. She had noticed that the apartment Conrad had moved into, at Celeste's suggestion, closer to her office, had no elevator, which Celeste seemed unaware caused Marguerite significant difficulty. She had noticed that her calls to Conrad were frequently returned several hours late, with an apologetic explanation that he had been at an event she hadn't been invited to. She had also noticed the way Celeste watched the dining room at Auberge d'Orval during their third visit. And she had noticed Fiona, quiet professional Fiona, who had appeared at her side like an answered question 3 weeks earlier, disappear from the room immediately after Celeste set her menu down. She had added these things together in the way that she had learned to add things together when words were not available to her. In January, Marguerite wrote Conrad a letter on cream stationery with her old letterhead from the Trois-Rivières business days, and she put it directly in the inside pocket of his winter coat, where his assistant could not find it, where Celeste could not see it, where it would reach him the way she intended, directly, personally, without intermediary. She told him about Fiona. She told him about every visit, what Fiona had signed, what it had meant to her to spend a single dinner as a person with a language instead of a problem to be managed. She told him about the shift she had noticed after their second visit, the reassignments, the way Fiona's section had moved farther and farther from table 9. She told him that she believed this had not been a coincidence. She told him she was not asking him to choose. She was asking him to look. Conrad Whitfield found the letter on a Wednesday morning in January while he was looking for his parking card. He read it standing in the hallway of his building, still wearing his coat. He read it again. He was a man who had built a company from a one-office engineering firm into one of the largest infrastructure groups in the country, which required a specific kind of intelligence, the kind that identified load-bearing elements and understood which ones, if removed, would bring everything down. He had applied this intelligence professionally for 30 years. He had not applied it to his personal life in quite some time. He sat down on the bench in his hallway, still in his coat, and he thought about the fact that his mother had lost her hearing 4 years ago and that he did not know sign language. He thought about the letters on his desk he had not read. He thought about Celeste's hand on his arm at the restaurant, the proprietary sweep of gesture he had noticed but not examined. He thought about his mother eating dinner in silence while he laughed at a wine joke. He called Auberge Dorval that afternoon. He asked to speak with the manager. He asked whether a server named Fiona had recently been let go. There was a pause, and then yes. He asked why. Another pause. A reference to a client's preferences. Conrad said, very quietly, that he would like to understand which client. The manager's pause told him everything. Fiona found out on a Thursday afternoon. She was at the kitchen table doing the math on her father's February medications versus her severance, which was modest, when her phone rang from a number she didn't recognize. A man's voice, low and careful, introduced himself as Conrad Whitfield. He said he believed he owed her an apology. He said he had recently learned that she had been dismissed from her position as a direct result of requests made by his family, and that he had not known this was occurring and would not have permitted it if he had. Fiona said nothing for a moment. She said, "Thank you for calling." He asked if she was currently employed. She said, "Not yet." He said that his company ran several corporate dining facilities and that he had recently determined they were understaffed at the senior level, and that if she was interested, he would be glad to have his HR director reach out. He said it in the manner of someone making a business proposition, not a charity offer, which she appreciated. She said she would think about it. He said he understood, and then he paused, and he said, "My mother wanted me to tell you something," she said, "and I'm sorry. I'm reading from a note here because I wanted to get the words right." She said, "Tell her that she gave a deaf old woman a voice at a table full of noise, and I have not forgotten it." Fiona was quiet. She said, "How is she?" Conrad was quiet too for a moment. "Better," he said. "I found an ASL instructor. We're having our first lesson next week." A pause. "It's been 4 years. I should have done it 4 years ago," Fiona said. "You're doing it now?" "Yes," he said. "I'm doing it now." She did not take the corporate dining position in the end, though she thanked him. What she did was call the University of Ottawa's nursing faculty, and then she called her brother in Vancouver, and then she sat down with her father on a Sunday afternoon and told him she had been thinking about going back to school. Her father said, "I've been thinking about that too." He was having a good day. His hands were manageable. He was wearing the cardigan her mother had given him the last Christmas before she died, the dark green one with the wooden buttons. And the afternoon light was coming through the window at the angle that made the kitchen look almost golden. He said, "You've been holding this family together long enough, Fee. Let me hold it for a while." She said, "Dad, you have Parkinson's." He said, "I know what I have. I also know what you gave up. I'm not going to spend whatever time I've got watching you not live your life." She didn't cry. She almost cried. She pressed her thumb into the wood grain of the kitchen table and breathed through it and didn't cry. She registered for the bridging program in March. She told Marguerite in a letter. She had Marguerite's address from the HR coordinator at Whitfield Group, who had given it after a brief conversation with Conrad. And Marguerite wrote back on the cream stationery in the careful cursive and told her that this was exactly right, and that the world needed nurses who had learned that the most important thing you could give a patient was not always medicine. Sometimes it was just your hands. The last time Fiona saw Celeste Duval was not at Auberge Dorval. It was at a bakery in the Glebe. In April, a bakery Fiona had gone to since she was 12 because they made the particular almond croissant her father loved. She was there on a Saturday morning in her nursing school scrubs, which she was wearing because she had a lab that afternoon and hadn't gone home to change, and she was holding a white paper bag and waiting for her coffee when Celeste walked in. Celeste was impeccably dressed, as always. She did not recognize Fiona immediately. People rarely recognized servers outside their context, and then she did, and something passed across her face, a calculation happening behind her eyes. Fiona looked at her for a moment. She thought about what Marguerite had signed at the service station on that last night. "You gave me an evening." She thought about Sebastian's expense reports. She thought about the red light on the Champlain Bridge. She thought about her father in his green cardigan, the afternoon light coming through the window. She picked up her coffee. She smiled at Celeste, not warmly, not coldly, just evenly, the way you smile at someone who no longer has any power over anything that matters to you. And she walked out into the April morning, which was sharp and bright and smelled like the last of the snow and something green coming up through it. And she went home to her father. The almond croissant, as always, was perfect.